All right, so in the previous video, we talked about the background of the Allied strategies, kind of the stuff that they have to deal with, specifically the U.S. fighting a two-front war, and kind of the reason why we talk about, why Germany is considered the bigger threat and how that kind of affects the fact that we spend a little more time taking on Japan because of their expansion, and we'll revisit Japan in the next video here. So what we're looking at today is kind of the major turning point battles for the Allies that kind of help set up more successes in defeating both Germany and Japan, and then we're going to focus primarily here on defeating Germany, so describing the actions the Allies took to defeat it. So, quickly kind of going over the battles that turned the tide in favor of the Allies. So we've talked about, a big bunch of stuff so far. So we've talked about, the Allied defeat in Europe. We've talked about Pearl Harbor. We mentioned a bit on Guadalcanal being the first, Allied invasion to kind of blunt the Japanese invasions of the Pacific. So we're going to go more in depth with a few of these here. So as the Japanese are expanding in 1942 across the Pacific Ocean, they get stopped at this one specific tiny island in kind of in its direction of Hawaii, and that is Midway, which is a U.S. territory. And so we talked about it when we looked at Pearl Harbor, that, again, the big thing that they missed at Pearl Harbor, one of the big things they missed was the aircraft carriers, which were not there. And they know that aircraft carriers are going to play a very vital role in the fact of this war, because it means that you can essentially have your planes fly from any location where these aircraft carriers are, get within a few hundred miles of an island, and attack, which is essentially what happened at Pearl Harbor. So this was the chance for the U.S. to defeat the Japanese Navy and actually blunt their offensive capabilities. So when the Japanese send their ships and their planes over, they put their aircraft carriers a couple hundred miles away from Midway, and the Allies and the U.S. knows that that's coming. They let their planes out to attack Midway, and then the U.S. sends its aircraft carriers, which are a couple hundred miles in a different direction. Once the Japanese fighters are over Midway, because it's a couple-hour flight, to protect their aircraft carriers, the U.S. locates the aircraft carrier fleet and then begins to attack. And so the inevitability is that it stops Japan from invading Midway, and it damages a lot of their aircraft carriers and essentially prevents the Japanese from any further expansion further eastward towards Hawaii in that sense. So this is kind of where the Japanese expansion is halted, especially with their capabilities with the aircraft carriers. So that plays a big role later on for the United States. In Russia, in 1942, the Germans in the summertime restart their offensive, this time going in a different direction. Instead of just focusing on Moscow, they go further into south-central Soviet Union, looking more for oil and coal mining. That's kind of found in these areas. And so that one big town, especially because it has the name of, the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, in it, Germany throws several millions of troops into this battle at Stalingrad, which lasts for about 4 or 5 months. It's the bloodiest battle of the war. Hundreds of thousands of people are killed in this fight. The city is essentially destroyed. But an entire German army is in fact surrounded and defeated, and that essentially prevents the Germans from, again, splitting the Soviet Union in half. And this is the furthest that they are able to go into the Soviet Union. And from now, it's a very long, slow road back for the Soviets to push the German army back towards Germany. So we'll look at the map here in a minute. At the same time, in October 1942, the German army, having gone into North Africa to support the Italians, who are losing to the British, so this is kind of where the British army is at this point as they build up for that invasion of Europe, or their invasions of Europe with the United States. There's a massive war going on in North Africa as the Germans and the Italians are trying to get to the Middle Eastern oil fields that are pretty much being controlled by, or at least influenced by, the United Kingdom, the British. And so at El Alamein in Egypt, the German army is turned back by the British. So the German Africa Corps had been doing a really tremendous job of pushing the war forward in this direction, but are blunted here, and it stops them from getting to those oil fields. We'll talk about D-Day. That's going to come up later in this episode. So here's our Far East Pacific map. Here is our Battle of Midway. We also talked about the fact that the Japanese did take some Aleutian Islands here. But you can kind of see how much closer they were getting towards Hawaii in this sense. All right. So a number of aircraft carriers, 5 of them actually end up getting destroyed, including a few of them that were at the Battle of Pearl Harbor. So very essential that the United States win that battle here. Now the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, where we're talking about down here, all right, essentially, again, prevents the Japanese from reinforcing and heavily taking out Allied numbers here inside of area of New Guinea and Australia. Right. So here is the furthest German extent in the Eastern Front, 1942. Pretty much this is where they were essentially in 1941. They were actually on the borderline of Moscow. But again, in 42, they were pressing down in this direction. Here's Stalingrad, and that's where they end up losing a bunch of people. El Alamein is right here. And then it's a long, slow road back through Libya and over towards Tunisia. So one of the big things that the Allies have to focus on, however, as we said in the last video, is the U-boats, the submarines. All right, as effective as the Germans were in World War I, they're more effective in World War II. Because again, we're talking about submarines, more advanced capabilities. So the Allies are able to overcome the U-boat threat in 3 ways. One is the convoy system, much like World War I. So essentially putting them in massive convoys that have a number of warships that go around them, so that way when you're in a pack, you're less likely to be attacked, and you're more likely to get the submarines that attack you. The United States, again, being that great arsenal of democracy, getting the full war effort behind it, we're able to produce more ships faster than the Germans can destroy them, which is essential. And then the technology that the Allies are able to build up, so sonar, radar, being able to detect them, using depth charges to locate and destroy submarines, bringing them up to the surface, all help to blunt the damage that the German U-boats can destroy. And now here's the actual statistics. This is not good. So here it is, all 12 months of the year, January through December, each year. And then this is the number of Allied ships that are destroyed per month throughout the entirety of the war. All right. So 1940, we're looking early on in the war, over 100 here, by, kind of about 350 in the month of, I guess, October. And then it goes down, then, World War II actually begins for the United States, and then it skyrockets in 42 and early 43, the paradise of the U-boats. All right, where we're losing almost 700 ships in 2 or 3 months. All right, and this is trying to get our aid over to Britain. So when we finally actually get a, high-reaching effectiveness in terms of, the sonar and the convoy system, these losses are kept pretty hidden throughout much of the United States' time in the war, so much that this would be very disheartening for the Americans to hear about the number of ships being destroyed on their way over to North Africa, to the Soviet Union, to Great Britain, in Europe. All right, then we finally begin to, take away from almost, again, 500-600 of ships per month, into, as the war went on, less than 100 a month. Which, again, still very heavy losses, very tragic, but again, it shows the effectiveness that the U-boats had and the big threat that they were having on our shipping. So, as we said, German first policy, Allies have to build up time to get themselves ready for that invasion of Western Europe, all right, which the Soviet Union is currently asking for, or constantly asking for. So, El Alamein over here, in late 1942, we begin our invasion of North Africa. These are the very first time that American Army soldiers are ready to go outside of the Pacific. And so it actually takes about a solid 6 months for them to actually conquer all of North Africa after their initial landings in Morocco and Algeria, but they are blunted at Tunisia for a couple of months before they're able to finally get themselves that experience to help slow down the German advances in Russia, take that pressure off the Soviet Union, and get experience here. All right. Now, it's a losing fight for the Germans and the Italians, but it's an inevitable one that they're trying to slow down the American and British efforts, which again ends April and May 1943. So it took about 6 months or so from their initial invasions of North Africa to get this close. All right. Then that was followed up by the invasion of Italy, starting with the island of Sicily down here, and then in September 1943. Now, this leads to Italy surrendering right before the actual Allied invasion of the mainland of the Boot down here. And again, it draws more and more German material, more German forces here, and essentially takes the main force of the Italian army and navy out of the war. However, the big issue is that the Italian terrain is very mountainous, very hilly, very much rivers all across the continent, or not the continent, the country. And so Italy as a country, we invaded in 1943, September. A year and a half later, we still haven't fully taken the entirety of the country, all right, because of the natural defenses that it actually possesses. So this is some of the worst fighting and some of the worst casualties that the United States actually faces while fighting the Nazis is here in Italy. But that plays in a lot of stuff, and it's actually really, really sad. If you want to find stuff on Italy, I just kind of read a big book called Italy's Sorrow that looks at all the tragedies that kind of happen, both for the Allied and for the German forces, but also for the Italian people, because this essentially, after 23 years of dictatorship under Mussolini, it leaves Italy as a complete wreck. All right. So here's our Allied strategic bombing campaign that they were doing, blue here. Essentially, this is just 1944 to kind of help soften up the German borderlands. So primarily, we're talking about area bombing, transports, oil installations where they were targeting all these things for their plans for 44 and 45 to get themselves ready for this invasion, which levels a lot of Western Europe and a lot of Germany. All right. So the big thing that we've been planning now for about 2 years was this Allied invasion of France. Get back into Western Europe, and that comes with D-Day. All right, cross-channel invasion that occurs here, and actually it's a really cool story in terms of the way that the U.S. was able to prevent the Germans from actually knowing the location. It's actually pretty awesome in the way that sense. Just going to take a look at time here, so we got 4 minutes before this video has to conclude. So the Allies use a diversionary tactic, essentially showing the Germans that there's going to be an attack somewhere else, further up, closer to France itself, because this is actually the second closest landing location in northern France that the Allies could have done. And so essentially, they're using all these falsified things. They're bombing all over the place, but Hitler has had a number of years to get ready. And essentially, Hitler is banking on the idea that we're going to prevent them from invading on the coastline. The Allies are thinking, and even the best German generals are thinking, well, we can't actually keep them off the coast forever. All right, but they wanted to fight on the interior. Hitler wanted to fight on the coast. So, but the Allies also use airborne troops, all right, behind the lines that actually they're kind of dropped all over the peninsula, which actually works out pretty well because it's more of a distraction. But the Germans are so much believing that the Allied invasion is going to come at a different location in France that they, after a number of days and weeks, don't actually throw in most of their forces into this area to prevent the Allied advance. All right. So it's the largest convoy ever involved in terms of the cross-channel invasion. One German, this is a paraphrase, when he looked out of his bunker and saw the endless array of ships, hundreds of them throughout, that's when I knew that Germany would lose the war. So 2 clips that are going to be in the PowerPoint that you can click on here when you go through it yourself. From Band of Brothers, the D-Day jump, for what the paratroopers had to go through, jumping behind enemy lines a couple hours before the invasion to try and help disrupt the Germans and prevent any issues with terms of them being able to halt the Allied advance. And then Saving Private Ryan, which is, if you've ever played a Call of Duty game, Medal of Honor games, this is essentially, they all begin with D-Day. And the Saving Private Ryan clip is about 20 minutes long. It's pretty gory, but it does a pretty good job detailing what happens to the Allies as a result. The only difference between that and real life was the number of hours it actually took. Saving Private Ryan, they show that they can get over the areas at Omaha Beach in about 20 minutes. In reality, it took several hours, but it follows along the pretty true story. All right. And just because of time, we will stop here. So we'll cover up Germany and begin with Japan in the next video.